Hello, and welcome to the New Mission Career Transition podcast. I'm your host, Chris Caprellian, and I'm joined by my co-host, sister, and HR professional, Alexandra Caprellian. Today's guest is Corie Weathers. She is a subject matter expert in military family culture. She is a military clinical consultant, executive coach, licensed counselor, military spouse of the year, and the author of her most recent book, Military Culture Shift. And we're going to just lay it out there on what it means to find closure as you prepare for your own transition. It was a fascinating conversation, and man, just talk about a person that knows her research and knows her demographic. You're going to get something out of this, and particularly if you have a family that's going to join you on your transition, you're going to want to hear what she has to say. So stay tuned. Corie Weathers, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Chris and Alexander. I'm so excited. This is a great topic. So thank you for having me today.
I'm excited to have you here too.
Yes, me too. I got a copy of your book. We'll get into that in a little bit, but Military Culture Shift, the things that you wrote really connected with me and allowed me to understand and process some of my observations throughout my career in the military, and also really enlightening. And we'll get to that. And we're going to talk about transition and your experience as a licensed therapist helping military service members, military spouses, and certainly want to get your feedback on your observations. But before we do, I'm going to ask you some dangerously open-ended questions. Where did you grow up, and what is your association with the military?
Yeah, such an important question, especially for the military culture where you just never know what the right answer. And it's that dreaded, like, where are you from question, which time, right? So, no, I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. I was actually born at the Naval Hospital in Charleston. My dad was Air Force. At the time, he moved to Air Force Reserves and then later became a Delta pilot. So he was flying in and out of Atlanta and doing reserve work out of Charleston on the weekends. So most of my upbringing was in Atlanta, not typically having the military brat experience. So I call myself like a Southern city kid, and not really understanding the military at all before my husband, fast forward years later, after college in graduate school, my husband meeting a Green Beret in the gym, and coming home one day and saying he wanted to be in the military. And that was the first thought of this ever. Of course, I said no for a year and a half. And he was very serious. He waited me out until finally this shows everybody how naive I was in the beginning. I literally said, okay, you can go do the basic thing, then we'll decide. So I'm pretty sure he just was like, okay, let's try that. So no, we were more connected and fully all in once he joined and made this our life.
Wow. And I bet that's interesting. I think a lot of times, even in my own experience, I was already in before I started a relationship that became a marriage. And I think it's probably a little bit different because you go through this almost major lifestyle transformation along with your spouse who is on active duty. And I bet that has a different dynamic.
Yeah. It also was, I wouldn't say we were newlyweds. We were a couple years married by that point, but to have him go for 14 weeks and I was pregnant with our first child, to have that first separation and not even fully understanding, I just have so much empathy for spouses who are kind of going through this the first time, not having that experience and really just trying to understand what is this decision that we're making. And you hear spouses say all the time, people say, you signed up for it or, you knew what you were walking into. And we always say, like, we really do not know what we're walking into. And you really have to come in being willing to kind of just figure it out as you go and be all in if you can be all in if possible. And that we're going to get to that, I'm sure, as we're talking about the shifts of generations and their perspectives of this culture, because we're seeing a lot of young families that have a very different perspective on that.
Yes. And just to clarify for our audience, like where you're at now, married, husband, chaplain, correct?
Yes, yes. We have been in, I think 16 years, but I feel like I've been saying 16 years for like 2 years. So I don't really know where we're at this point. 16, about 16 years. We're currently at Fort Cavazos, formerly Fort Hood. I like to say Fort Hood. I get more sympathy when I say that. But yeah, we actually asked to be here. We needed some stabilization for our kids. We were moving about every year and a half. This was our seventh move in 9 years.
Mm.
So we asked to slow down just a little bit, and we've been able to do that here at Fort Cavazos. I have two boys. One is at Texas A&M. He's a sophomore, about to be a junior at Texas A&M in the Corps of Cadets. A few years ago, to those parents that are listening, he said the military was ruining his life, and now he's in the Corps of Cadets waiting on an Air Force waiver. And then we also have a soon-to-be senior in high school.
Mm.
Okay. Wow. Sounds like you've got an
A
impending
lot.
transition yourself.
Yes. And that's what's crazy is we're talking about transition. We're about to be empty nesters. Our next PCS will be an empty nest move. So
Mm.
we're looking forward to it. We're scared. We're excited. So many emotions as I think any transition is going to bring up.
Okay. Great. So let's come up to the present. Like, what are you doing now?
So many things. So many things. Yeah. So I'm a licensed professional counselor by trade. That's what I always knew that I wanted to do. But this military life has thrown obviously a lot of curveballs. I had 5 different licenses in different states at one point. And so fast forward to now, I've just really I needed to have a creative career. I also knew that I wanted to be all in into this community and culture. And over the years, I took that clinical background and really zoomed out to really study the tribe that I live in and work with and serve every day. And so that turned into, I still do some counseling. I still do more so coaching for a lot of families. We can talk about that difference if you would like. But also teaching. I really am a teacher at heart. So I travel and do leadership development training for all the branches, a lot of the leaders that are really wrestling through the different generations and what has changed in our culture. So that's a lot of what I'm doing right now is I'm really passionate about, as that clinical side of me is passionate about being a bridge builder, helping our tribe be what it needs to be in order to face future conflicts. Very team oriented. We're having a lot of fracturing, a lot of conflict. And so kind of like a big family meeting or maybe even a family counseling session, that's been my latest passion, is to really come into these spaces and help leaders work better together, lead better, especially with the shifts and changes that we're seeing in our culture today. And also encouraging leaders to lead with strength when there's just so much public attention and spotlight on our military and their leaders today. That's definitely getting harder too. So leaning a little bit more towards teaching, but still with that clinical heart.
Mm.
Great. And fascinating. I'm sure through your practice, you've also encountered um, service members, veterans, military spouses, and families that have gone through transitions in their own lives. Some of it might actually be a transition out of the military. We know that's one major one. There might be other transitions that I'm just not familiar with because I'm not in your profession. Could you give us an understanding of kind of the range of challenges that you help coach and counsel individuals through in your practice?
Yeah, as you were just asking that question, you're talking about the different transitions. It made me think that I think there's so many transitions we go through in our lifetime, whether it's just as a human being or in relationships. And then there's also the military specific transitions that we go through. So I think as a clinician, there's everything from transitioning into the military. There is transitioning into parenthood. There is, this empty nest transition we're about to go through. So I think there's a lot of just developmental milestones that can definitely be transitions, not to include, or not to forget like all the PCSs and all. I just feel like our culture as a whole is doing nothing but transition and facing change all the time. But yes, I have worked with all those mini transitions, if you want to call them that. I've worked with couples, a lot of couples in what I call post-betrayal recovery. So that could be infidelity, that could be financial betrayal. There's lots of different kinds of betrayal in relationships. So how do we recover a relationship and transition into a whole new and, also what can be a better relationship on the other side. But especially lately in the last, I would say 5 years, maybe 7 years, getting a lot of couples going through the transition of retirement, or just switching their career. A lot of those millennials that are leaving kind of mid-career, if you want to call it that. And a lot of people reaching out wanting to transition well. And what does that look like, not only as an individual, but as a couple? So I think over the course of my almost 20 years as a clinician, I've seen so many different topics, everything from trauma to trauma in relationships to those that just really want to be a better leader or grow individually and just wanting a good, healthy checkup. But also more than ever, these transitions of just to a whole new season of life. And what does that look like outside of this community?
Mm. And it sounds like, and I think we're both using the word transition, but at the end of the day, and correct me if I'm wrong, or maybe your thoughts on the matter, we're really talking about adapting to change, adapting to significant change. And what is significant can be completely different for different people. It's kind of in the eye of the beholder. Is that about an accurate summation?
Yeah, I think it really is. I think you're bringing up some great insight on that. Like I think that we pride ourselves in this community as being able to adapt to change easily. I love the Gallup Strength Finder as an assessment. I mean, I think every clinician and coach probably has their favorite assessment. But that's my favorite simply because it's so positive. It's like I always say the blast radius on it is huge. We can address everything from parenting to leadership to going through changes and adapting. And one of the things I love about it is adaptability is actually a strength, is actually a talent that Gallup measures. And not everybody is talented or good at adapting. And I think that's really important to understand. And it gives so many and I'll say me included, because out of 34 themes, adaptability is number 33 for me, meaning that is that is not a strength for me. And my husband was not at all surprised that that was low for me, because every time there was a PCS or every time there was a change, I really struggled with that. I freaked out thinking the world was coming to an end. But really it came down to that is not a strength of mine, and it never will be a strength of mine. And so learning how do I adapt, or what are the skills or the tools or the people or the support that I need around me in order to make those big changes. So when we talk about how do we adapt to these big changes, I think it's really important to talk about that some people are better at that than others. My 17-year-old has adaptability in his top 5. So I call those people my whatever people. They're literally the people that when you say, where do you want to go out to eat? They're like, wherever you want to go. Like I can adapt, right? And so there are just some people that are literally more adaptable than others. So to those that are listening, it's okay for even you and your spouse to go into change and adapt to those changes in very different ways and bringing different strengths with you to help you navigate that change. But I think that it's okay for us to accept the fact that it can be really, really challenging. And some transitions are harder than others, and we need to be graceful with ourselves.
Hmm.
Hmm.
And I think, wow, I mean, I'm listening to this and it brings up a couple of other ideas, where it's not just about understanding whether or not we're adaptable. And maybe there's a little bit of nature, but there's probably a lot of nurture throughout a military career for the service member. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the other members in your immediate family are as adaptable. And I mean, I'm sure you can't have a 5-year-old take the Gallup Strength Finder.
Okay.
Oh, really?
Actually reading, there's a kid's version that if they can read on a 3rd grade level. So I don't know if a 5-year-old can do that. So maybe not a 5-year-old, but I mean, and I could go down this rabbit hole, and I know there's so much for us to talk about, but if you have kids, especially if you have more than 2, or if you have a sibling yourself, you probably look back on their childhood and you realize they were always kind of that person, right? Like my oldest son has always been craving order, leaning towards wanting more structure, wanting more routine. And then, of course, I have my 17-year-old who thrives on chaos and loves, just struggles to clean his room. And he's always been that way, right? But that's what makes him so adaptable. So yes, you can actually, and this showed up in their young child version, the kids version of the strengths early on, where I needed all the help that I could get as a parent as we were PCSing. Like, how do we navigate this change, and what do each of the kids need, and what do they need differently, and what do we as a couple need as well? So yes, there actually is, and I think it's super informative and helpful. Sorry to
Uh,
interrupt you there, Chris.
no,
No.
no, that's gold. I mean, I've got an 8-year-old going on 14, and I didn't know that there was something that she could take to understand herself, and for me to understand her better, and not taking my understanding for granted, particularly as I go through my own transition. So I'm gonna have to do some research, and then if I can, I'll add it to the episode notes if I can find a link to that thing,
Absolutely.
because it sounds like it's a lot more where Myers-Briggs type indicator is pretty good at understanding our technical, soft and hard skills and applicability to an industry. I know I'm an INFJ, but there are so many other types. And then you've got the big five, which is sometimes it's a little bit more abstract. And I've done that. I don't know if maybe it was a type of test I went through where I didn't feel like I had a lot to grab onto from the assessment. But this is a new one, and I got to look into that. So that's great. So we talked a little bit about families, and I'm sure you've had exposure to service members, like you've said, that are preparing to retire, as well as their families travel on that path with them. But clearly, I think there's a difference in some of it's, and you'll probably be able to explain this. It's generational. There's a big difference between somebody like today, like myself, that has 21 years in, gonna retire at 22 years next year, from somebody who is second enlistment in, from a completely different generation. What are some of the challenges and perspectives they have as they prepare to transition out of the military?
Yeah, first of all, I think to answer that question, we have to zoom out and look at what's happening in the culture. So, and I think it's also really important that we understand each of our stories, and our stories become a lens through which we see all of these decisions, all of these choices that we're making. And so, and then you have our childhood and your background, your generation per se. I always say generational labels are a great starting point of discussion. It's kind of like the Myers-Briggs or any of these other personality assessments. Some people don't want to be put in a box. And so we're definitely today not saying that you have to be in one box, but it really does become a point of reference to start to understand what your values are and the lens through which you see these transitions. So when you talk about Gen X, especially if you've been in for 10, 15, 20 years now, you experienced a good portion of GWAT, a good portion of the last 2 decades of global conflicts. And that brings a whole other perspective on what you are transitioning out of. And we are seeing, from a values perspective, Gen X has always valued this kind of desiring and craving a healthy work-life balance. And I think it's one of the reasons why Gen X really struggled throughout GWAT, because there was a lot of deployments, a crazy tempo, this constant longing. And I'm not saying that other generations don't long to be with their family, but we just see the way that we make our decisions differently in each generation. For example, just to give an example, boomers, for example, definitely value work and family, and they value family now more than ever as they're retiring and are maybe grandparents or dealing with their own physical adversities and what retirement looks like for them. But I've had a lot of boomers that have said, especially men, that have said their willingness to work till 9 o'clock, their loyalty to the institution, they're working harder than, let's say, other generations who are maybe not willing to work past 5 o'clock if they can help it. That was really coming from a place of, this is how I provide for my family. This is how I provide security for my family. And that mindset may have felt like, as a kid, from my Gen X kid perspective, those of us that were latchkey kids, that they didn't care about family, but it was just how they invested in their family and took care of their family. But for those of us that are Gen X, I'm a Gen X, there is this longing to reclaim family time. There is this desire to get out and rest. There's so many Gen X that are burned out, exhausted, just the compounding stress that so many have gone through over the last 2 decades. If you've spent a lot of time in the military, has really reached this peak of cynicism for some, um, almost depression for some of what does it mean for GWAT to be over? We're grateful, but what's next? And how is America feeling about that? And how connected am I feeling to the nation, to my family members? So what does that look like for me to get out? It can feel a whole lot different if you've spent a majority of your time serving a global conflict that had ups and downs, victories, losses, actual friends that you've lost, and then to have the Afghanistan withdrawal happen the way that it did, and then now talking about retiring into the civilian sector. That's a completely different kind of transition than what we're seeing from the millennial generation, where it's a mass exodus right now from the military culture. We are seeing so many mid-level leaders, or those that have just now had maybe a first opportunity to take command, that are making the choice to leave the military because of the pension changes, but also an opportunity to have a second career. And I think the last thing that I'll say is that millennials they've always kind of had this different mindset. And you can hear the difference between what I just said about the boomers and their perspective of being loyal to the institution, versus millennials who really have this mindset of I can sell my talent to the highest bidder. And that mindset of going into the civilian sector with the promise and the hope of a whole second career, that's a completely different kind of transition with maybe even some excitement. So my hope would be that everyone finds some level of excitement as you make this transition, but that we also have to have some hard conversations of what does that transition or this closure need to look like in order for you to enter into a new chapter.
And how does one approach that? I mean, how do you approach closure? And I say that as a person, I started really early. I had some benefits that kind of compelled me to start really early. And then I've seen folks where they're like just starting to think about it, and they've got 3 months left, and then they're on the outside. Like, so how would one, or should one, approach finding closure so that they can transition effectively?
Yeah, it's such an important topic. And I'm so glad that your podcast is really wrestling with this topic, because it is not a simple solution and probably not a one episode, answer, right? Like, this is something that I think people really need to think through. People who've listened to me talk a lot, they are familiar with the fact that I say we got to sit in the pocket. I think it's a counselor-y kind of phrase to say, but sit in the pocket of what it means to transition. And that means we do need to take the time to think this through. I mean, if you're a single service member and there's no consequences on anyone else's life but your own, and you want to do something impulsively, then I don't think the military lets you do anything impulsively. But if you want to make, quick decisions with less thought, I think maybe, I wouldn't say that's a great idea, because I think we're seeing veterans struggle with getting jobs in the civilian sector more than ever. The nation is struggling with, it's just not the same patriotic community that those that remember post 9/11. It's just not quite the same. And everybody in the economy is looking for jobs, struggling with jobs. We have new younger generations coming in with a different skill set. And so I think even that single service member needs to be very mindful that it may not be as easy to jump into the civilian sector and get the job that you think that everybody is going to hire veterans first. So that's, I think, good for you to keep in mind. But I think the bigger answer to your question is sitting in the pocket of what does it mean? How do I define what this experience has been like for me? And how do I make a good decision moving forward? And that answer is going to be different for you as a service member compared to your spouse. I say to a lot of couples, I remember when I first came in, all the talk about transition really being heavy about the veteran, and they're losing their identity and really struggling with that. And I'm not going to say that that's not happening still. I do think that with the close of no major global conflicts right now, that might be a little bit easier, because we feel like we have a little bit of closure. We're not leaving something unfinished, although there's a lot of feelings about how it finished. But I will say, for most service members, when you drop that packet, that was a decision that you made on a given day, however long you took to think about it. That was a decision that you were ready to do something different and start to close out this idea of a job. And it is a life for you, for sure. But I tell couples all the time, the service member is leaving a job, but the military spouse is leaving a life.
Mm.
And that's very different. And so spouses are not quite getting the same level of support, education, or even time to process what it means for them to leave this lifestyle, especially if they've struggled with building their own career and if they've invested a lot of volunteer hours, invested a lot of their time into the identity of being a military spouse. I'll never forget one couple who was trying to decide where they wanted to live. And the service member was really excited to live far, far away from any installation. And the military spouse just kind of had like this record scratch, which totally dates me, by the way, moment, where she was like, wait a minute, I don't know if I want to be that far from an installation. Like there's nostalgia and there is my people inside those gates. And so I want the opportunity to every now and then go into the commissary or drive on to an installation where I can feel grounded again. And so these conversations are super important.
Hmm. Let me ask you another question. And you mentioned identity. And I'm gonna share an observation, and I'd like to hear your opinion on it. I've observed, I think I've observed through this podcast and other observations before then that having a multidimensional or many different ways in which one would identify themselves, having diversity in identity, helps alleviate some of the transition out of the military. Because when you're stripping off the uniform, you're stripping off that type of mission and that type of purpose. But if you have other things to fall back on that are important to you, that make up who you are, it's a little bit easier compared to those that maybe are getting out after a second enlistment in the Army or the Navy or the Marine Corps, Air Force, where almost all their time, all their waking time is inside of a barracks, surrounded by those that wear the same uniform, talk the same language, and then working really long hours because that's how everybody's career starts. You're investing almost 100%, and the institutions that we belong to put a heavy emphasis on that for good military necessity, right? Like we have professional military education programs. Some services are a little bit different, but they tend to focus on your time after hours should be spent focusing on these military subjects. And then if you remove yourself from that, you're probably removing yourself at a point in time where you didn't develop a diversity of that identity. Your identity is very closely aligned to the uniform that you wear, the ethos that's behind it, and perhaps even the rank that you wear. Do you observe other difficulties in individuals going through a major transition where they have a lack of diversity in their self-identity compared to those that do?
Yeah, this is such a great point. Here's what's really interesting about what you're bringing up. First of all, I totally agree that the more diverse of everything from hobbies, interests, your identity and what you find your identity in, the more diversity you have in that, I think the easier the transition. So 100% agree with that. But what's really interesting about this is that this is actually what's creating some of the conflict between the generations in the force today. And we're in a very interesting place where we all recognize that it's healthy to have something outside of just this career in this community in the uniform. Like, especially the older generations who have lived out just having this sole identity and it being an all consuming community and culture, which most of us, and I'm including our family in that, most of us have grown to love and appreciate and want to pass down to the next generation. And it has been the people that have helped raise your children. It has been the people that walked with you through the darkest days, or maybe was with you when you had your first child and your service member was deployed, right? Like these are such amazing key moments in our development and our history and built amazing relationships. And so it's really hard to say that you would want to encourage anything different from that. And yet we would also agree that we need something outside of the community that is all consuming. So now when you have this younger generation, I'm going to say millennials and Gen Z that are coming in, and you're hearing things like, I don't want to go to hang out with my colleagues after work, and either to a military ball or to a family support meeting or to a fundraiser or a kids event, even when I can be in the community and be part of my running club, book club, video game group that we're all online playing video games, the same video game together. And you might even be playing video games with somebody in a different country, that it's a different perspective of community. Or you have young military spouses that are coming in that are going, I don't know if I want to be a military spouse. I kind of would like to have my career and let the service member go do their job. And I'm going to do my job. And we're going to have these two separate worlds. And I'd also like for us to not live on the installation and live in the community where we're close to our local church or to the baseball field or whatever it is that our family is involved in. And I think most of us who are older, who have had that experience of living in this all-consuming community that, again, has been wonderful, we're looking at the next generation with this diversity and this community involvement, and we're kind of freaking out, if I can be honest. Everybody's freaking out because it feels like the community that we have loved is falling apart, is fracturing, is not going to be there to support each other if something kicks off. And so everybody is freaking out. And yet, if you talk about it long enough, to your point, we're agreeing that we shouldn't let it be all consuming. So we're in a very interesting place where the younger generation is trying to make some healthy decisions based off of what they saw us go through. But in order for us to support them doing that, it's causing us to look in the mirror and take a look at our own life and ask, did we give everything to an institution and to a community that maybe we should have diversified a little bit? And yet, can you also hear me say that that was the choice that we made and that was what we needed and it worked well for us, and it's okay to not want to change that, but that it's also okay for the force to, during an interwar period, consider something different. So just that one question that you're asking, shouldn't we have a more diversified identity and involvement in everything from hobbies to other interests? Yes. But in order for us to answer that, all of us from these different generations have to take a look in the mirror and ask ourselves, what does that mean for my life? And what does that mean for other people? And what does that mean for our community for us to start practicing that?
Hmm. And it almost begs the question, do we need a comprehensive review of the services that we're providing service members and their families? Because you know, you're saying this and I'm automatically thinking of the times where one of the social touch points in my early career was at the officer club.
Yeah.
And now you've got crickets there. I mean, it's very hard to find anybody gathering there. I look at it as, well, man, that's a shame, because I just remember having so much fun as a lieutenant. And it was a great opportunity to talk with my peers. Whereas, are we holding on to these institutions to our own detriment, where not only are we not allowing individuals to pursue this diversification of who they are and pursue these other interests that aren't necessarily in an officer club, but also on directly and indirectly benefit their ability to transition because they become more resilient individuals.
Yeah. And please hear me say that this is such a hard conversation to have. And I'm not saying that the force should bend around one generation. I, as a clinician, come at this from a bridge builder perspective of just understanding the dynamics and maybe us pointing fingers a little bit less and just understanding. I had this amazing conversation last week with the Air Force in New Mexico, where just helping spouses, especially who were Gen X spouses getting ready to go through this transition, who were feeling not only burned out, not only discouraged because the younger generation wasn't showing up, but also just desperately needing a break. And one of the examples was talking about baby baskets, right? Like traditionally, something like when somebody was having a baby, everybody would rally together, and support that family who is far away from family and friends, maybe even an isolated location like we were last week. who might need that extra level of support. And yet nobody was showing up to help support this young family. And so we had to have a really hard conversation of, is that the best use of our energy for those of you who are actually asking for a break and needing to slow down and take care of yourselves, when it's the same 5 people that are running it every single time? To your point, like the club, it's the same people that are meeting up at the club. And again, nothing wrong with the tradition, but asking ourselves, what is the best use of our energy right now? And can the force, what I'm trying to encourage people to do right now is, I'm not here to say one solution is better than the other. I'm not saying we're going to throw everything away and start over. I don't think that's wise. There's a lot of wisdom we can pull from the past and what we've learned from the past. There's a lot of creativity and some great things that we can pilot that could be new. But I think right now, during this interwar period, this could be the closest we have to peacetime. And if that is true, then what does it look like to reconstitute our force that the older group, the older cohort is very weary? What does it look like to help them transition, to give them the respite that they need so that they're not crossing the finish line chasing respite? Like, we can get respite now. And like, just kind of, what does it look like for us to turn down some of the I don't know if our older cohort knows what a slowed down pace actually looks like. And so that's the real challenge, is how do we help slow you down? Is it really necessary for you to not only put out the same amount of energy you always have, but what does it look like for you to pass the baton to the next person, knowing they may not pick it up immediately? And can you still make these healthy decisions for you as you're about to transition?
Hmm.
That's a hard conversation.
Yeah, it is, because sometimes we're wed to what's comfortable to us. And, sometimes we have that deeply held anchoring bias that we know what it is that the younger generation needs, as opposed to kind of detaching from that bias and really looking at doing a really careful analysis of, well, where do we get the most return on the investment into the individual? And also, what do they need?
Yeah. And Chris, I realize I kind of didn't answer your question there. I do want to address the younger generation for just a second as they're transitioning, and say what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing from the younger generation for those that are transitioning. It goes back to that identity mindset that you brought up, is that if you are already a younger generation with these different hobbies, these different interests, where this you haven't really been in, I would really like to get some more information on the younger generation to see, is their beginning years as all consuming as maybe the Gen X and Boomer generations were during their younger years. When you have Gen Z, let's say in the barracks, that are, yes, during work, maybe working a lot, but in their off time, they're video gaming, they are connected virtually, their interests are in so many things. I would really be curious to see, is it really all consuming for them? Or are they coming in with a totally different mindset that they are not? I'm sure there are some that are coming in, this is what they've always wanted to do, but many of them are coming in for temporary job security, to take advantage of the benefits that are available while they're trying to figure out what their main career will be. Millennials and Gen Z have launched their careers, launched families far later than older generations. And so we're seeing a lot of people coming in, I'm not really sure what to do with my life. I'm not really sure what I want to do for a career. So I'm going to do this almost like a placeholder. So by the time they're deciding to do something different and transition different, I wonder if they are struggling less with this all-consuming experience, and maybe they've experienced a little bit more diversity, and that was what made them want to leave, because they are tracking that there is some more or different opportunities in the civilian sector that are available to them.
Hmm. Yeah, and directly relates to also retention. So if you want to incentivize retention, what's the ecosystem that we want to create? And wow, I mean, just talk about me. I have to call myself out on the perspective that the first 2 enlistments or the first 8 years that you have in the military are all consuming. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's just me, and that in and of itself is an indication of a generational difference.
That's a great question. And I'm going to take that with me as I go and talk with some of the younger generations and see if we can find the answer on that. But I think it's a really good question.
All right, cool. I contributed to the guest knowledge this time because you're the expert. That's great. Well, this actually is a great segue. I'd like to mention your book. You're an author of 2 books. Your most recent book is Military Culture Shift. And I know I'm not saying the whole title.
It's long.
Could you,
It's okay.
well, maybe you could share the whole title. I thought it was absolutely fascinating. I admit I'm only like halfway through it because I'm reading this thing and I get 2 pages in and all of a sudden my brain is spinning and I've highlighted almost 3/4 of every page. So tell us a little bit about your book and what the premise is.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for reading. And you're one of my favorite readers because when I find other data nerds and other people who, it's a lot of us Gen X that are used to highlighting our textbooks, right? That need to tab things and highlight things. And yeah, after 20 years as a clinician, 15 years serving this community, I really enjoy looking for patterns, whether I'm working with a couple, whether I'm working with a family, or whether I am looking at the whole culture. Patterns are really how you can change something in your own life, even. And so, if you can discover the unhealthy patterns in your own life or in your own relationship, if you adjust the pattern, you can start a whole new, healthier pattern. And so, that's a family systems perspective in the clinical world. How do you, being the one person that you have control over you and nobody else, how do you shift yourself and therefore start a new pattern in those that you relate with? And so, as I was seeing our culture change, whether it was families turning out for social events less, or the nation changing and their perspective of military and global involvement, as I was seeing some of the issues that we were beginning to struggle with, and just the visibility of all that toxic leadership, sexual harassment, just all of these. I mean, we got here to Fort Cavazos as the Vanessa Guillen thing was kicking off, and just that was everywhere, right? I was really frustrated when the recruiting crisis started to be reported on because it felt like, and again, I'm dating myself here, but it felt like the institution, understandably so, was addressing each of these singular issues like whack-a-mole. If anybody remembers like Chuck E. Cheese, whack-a-mole, like it's just so much happening and you're just going after one at a time. And I think I got really frustrated because there was a lot of finger pointing. There was a lot of negativity. And this is a tribe that I love so much that I was like, I'm going to sit back, zoom out a little bit. And what does it look like? Like, what's really going on in our culture? What has shifted? And what are all those variables that have contributed to this very wicked problem that we find ourselves in? So the book is, it's a beast of a book. I'm going to be honest with you. My first book is a much easier read. That's more about marriage. But I knew that if we were going to change any patterns within our culture, we were going to have to look at ourselves. We're going to have an honest conversation. And I knew it was going to be about each leader. How does each leader lead differently? So it is meant for military leaders to read and hopefully elevate your thinking. But I also wanted to write it so that spouses could read it and it would not be over their head. But I knew that where our leaders were going to be, the best place to catch them would be in the military institutions before they take command. So I knew I needed to read it, or I needed to write it almost like a cultural analysis. So it feels at times like a little bit of a textbook. At other times it's a story. And at other times it's a leadership book. And so that was what I had in mind the whole time, to really help, number one, anybody who's in the community to feel seen, to feel like they're reading their story, that it's making sense of some of the things that you've been through, but especially to help you understand what has changed, how did we get here? And that can better inform what we do tomorrow by seeing the lens, like we said in the very beginning, the lens through which I'm leading. Why am I leading? Why do I value the things that I value? And what do other generations value? And how do we work better together so that we can still have a force to defend our nation? And I think that's something that a lot of people are growing concerned about.
One of the things that I thought was really fascinating in your practice, trying to help somebody that underwent a traumatic event, let's say an OEF veteran, Operation Enduring Freedom veteran, anybody that was in Afghanistan, part of the therapeutic process is being able to put a name on what you're feeling.
Yeah.
And trying to find purpose in the suffering. I'm a big Viktor Frankl fan, and his logotherapy talks all about that. And
Good,
so,
then you'll like the last chapter.
oh, good. All right. I'll get to that. That's awesome. Um, and so you come up with a purpose behind it. And some of the purposes is like it was contributing to the mission. It was taking care of the Marine, soldier, sailor, airman to my left and right. And then you see what unfolds in Afghanistan. And all of a sudden you start to really, not only in the process of questioning the very purpose of your service, it probably, it opens the wounds again that you had taken so long to heal. And I found that fascinating as somebody that I've been deployed to Afghanistan once. I was mostly on the FOB, as most service members are, but it was an interesting look into those that had a lot of combat, intense combat experiences, and some of the things that they need to go back and work on because of that. And I'm not making a political opinion or a political argument here. I'm just saying I thought it was a very interesting observation. And to that point, and I'd like you to comment on that if I missed something in it, but what are other takeaways that we could use from your book, Military Culture Shift, to help inform our own transition?
Yeah. Thank you for all of that. First of all, um, so many thoughts. First of all, I had a rare opportunity to go to Afghanistan in 2015. I traveled with the Secretary of Defense. Their idea was to take a military spouse that was not on staff and let them see deployment conditions and try to write about that in a way that family members would maybe understand better, which how am I going to do that different than every service member that's come home and tried to explain that to their spouse, right? But I will say, having been to Afghanistan and I felt the weight of being there and just the loss that we had gone through as a family and the people that we had lost. And from this, before the plane even landed, I was in tears. And then to see the mountains and to see like just what we had left there, like we left a lot. We left my husband's innocence there. We left, lives had been lost there, and it cost our family a lot. And so just having just that little piece of what so many military members carry so much more than that, was something in my heart already. But I will say that watching the community, COVID was, I thought, going to be a breaking point for our community. And I look back and I now call it a psychological breaking point. It was too much. We had endured so much as a culture, and we haven't even started to process that. We just moved through it like we are taught to move through everything. Just adapt, like we said in the beginning, move through, and isn't that what we're good at? So just keep going and not processing it. And what it ended up being is a false peak. And so we kind of like crashed a little bit, and then we kept going. And then the Afghanistan withdrawal happened. And that's where I saw our community really crash for real. And coming from a spouse perspective, but also a clinical perspective, my husband is a clinician. He's also a chaplain. I would say our jobs and who we are as a couple is to have our finger on the pulse and the temperature and the morale of our culture at all times. And that's what I knew. Like, if we don't address the morale, if we don't address what's under the surface that nobody either wants to say or feels allowed to say or doesn't even know how to begin to process, that's what we have to look at. And so that's so important for transition. When I say sit in the pocket and ask yourself, what does it mean for you to transition? What does it mean for you? What is it going to take for you to have closure? I do think that we all kind of eventually take our rightful seat, and I don't mean this in a negative way, in a proud way, take our rightful seat in the VFW, right? Metaphorically speaking, or actual, right? And we're all going to have our war stories that we share and those moments that were amazing to us. But I knew I did not want us to take that seat with the wounds and still carrying those wounds that we've seen so many of our Vietnam veterans carry too. And that's going to take our own level of work, in our relationships in our home and in our marriages, but also a much deeper conversation with the nation that we can do proactively ahead of time. And so I'm just encouraging those that are transitioning. I think that's what the book is about. It is, whether you are brand new coming into the military, I reflect and talk about your values because I want you to be seen too. but it's also giving you this inside understanding of your leaders and why they might be leading the way that they are and why there are certain things that are very important to them. And that maybe we can do a better job of not writing off each other, but that we can not expect us to have the same experiences, the same visceral grounding into our memories, but instead lead with wisdom. If you have those experiences of GWAT, we have wisdom to offer, and wisdom can be more powerful than stories. And with a trusting relationship, that's, I think, my encouragement to those that are needing to think about this before you transition. What wisdom can you bring into this transition as you go into whatever that next chapter is, whether it is raising your kids, whether it is going after another career, or whether you're like one of those that want to just get an RV and go off the grid. Like, I totally respect that, right? But you have wisdom, and maybe it's time to start collecting that, deciding what that is, because the next generation of wherever you find yourself needs that wisdom, is craving that wisdom, and wants to hear it from you. Again, it's different from just a story. So I would say that's the thing that we've got to start doing before you make those big decisions, or as you make those big decisions. Bring your spouse in on that too. And if you're a younger generation, you have something to take to the nation, take to your local communities as well, of what does the inside of the military actually look like. There's a lot of what I would say kind of false information being spread around. And we as a community don't get to use our voices very easily. And so helping to kind of educate your family members, educate your local community about what does it mean to serve, and the value of service is still very real, whether it's in the military or just in your local community. And so you have an incredible opportunity for wisdom as well as you transition. So I think, to kind of summarize all of that, I think this is really about, how do you bring purpose and meaning to your experience? Whether it was 4 years or whether it was 20 or whether it was 30. This is just a chapter in the novel of your life. There is going to be future chapters. And there were chapters before you joined too. And they all go together in this amazing novel, this amazing story of who you are, what you believe in, why things are important to you. We can learn from older generations that maybe we don't need to keep all of that inside and let it make us sick. So how do you bring purpose to this closing chapter and do something on the other side that brings meaning to all of that? Invest in the next generation, mentor someone, but bring meaning to it, or serve in a charity, something that brings meaning to it all.
That's great. Sis, you have any questions?
I wish I had more pivotal questions, but I feel that this has just been so informative, and I've been enjoying every moment of it. But I do want to ask a question that you mentioned that we could get into it just a little bit. In the very beginning, you mentioned almost, dare I say, almost 3 pillars to the work that you do, and the focus areas of being counseling, coaching, and teaching. And you mentioned counseling and coaching, and that there are differences between the two. Could you just explain a little bit about that?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking that and remembering that. Yeah, the stigma with counseling has been there for a long time. I think everybody's familiar with that. I was one of the clinicians early on that was like, hey, come to counseling anyways. There's workarounds. And we may not have time to go into all the intricacies of it, but I will just say, it is true that if you're going to, and I hate to say this also comes down to money from the provider perspective, but also the family perspective of who's going to pay for this service that I'm needing. And that's important to understand, because in order for your insurance to pay for counseling for you, the provider has to give you a diagnosis. It's kind of like you can't go to the doctor without there being something wrong, unless you have a checkup, and that's a separate code and a separate benefit that they can provide you, right? But if there's not anything wrong, then what are you seeing the doctor for, right? And so if you are going to use your TRICARE benefits and get counseling or any other insurance benefits, the clinician has to give you a diagnosis. Now, most of us give adjustment disorders for mild things, but at some point, a lot of clinicians, especially post-COVID, we really got uncomfortable with the whole system of giving people a diagnosis that they didn't need. And really that being there as an exchange of money. And that didn't feel like it had a lot of integrity behind it. And what I've also found is that coaching gives people, the downside is that it's usually private pay, but it gives people the opportunity to get the help that they need off the radar for a lot of our special operations, or if you have clearance and you're concerned about the stigma, or you just want to do something mild and have an occasional coaching session, whether it's to grow personally or professionally, or some that are transitioning that would like some executive coaching, or I'm thinking about starting my own business, or that's not like a counseling relationship, but you just need somebody else to walk alongside you, empower you, help you with the strength finder, find your strengths, understand your weaknesses. What obstacles are you going to run into? But I also found that the military community tends to be a lot faster paced than the clinical world. And so there was so much frustration with people trying to find a clinician. It would take 10 to 20 sessions. Now I'm talking about those that aren't dealing with a moderate to severe diagnosis where you need to have monitoring on your medications. And, we're not talking about that. We're talking about mild to moderate, or life stressors, or marriage issues, or career issues, or parenting issues. Those kinds of things I found our community really enjoy a faster pace. They're really good at, like, I know what the issue is, I'm just stuck and I need to get moving forward again. Coaching is a great faster paced solution where there is no diagnosis, very minimal paperwork. It's just between you and the coach with no other third party involved. And so I found that, especially being a teacher at heart, I really enjoy the coaching, teaching side of things. And my strength, in the Strength Finder, I'm a developer. So I love when people get excited and get a little bit of help, and then they just launch forward. There's nothing that brings me more joy than to see that movement. And so I think that just kind of fits my personality as well. But that's a great question. And it's an important answer, because with the current shortage of providers that we're seeing in the mental health space right now, it's very important for people to understand the difference between, do you need actual medical care, or do you just need a friend, a coach, a mentor, or someone else that has some experience that can help you get unstuck? Those are very different.
Thank you.
Wow. Okay. That's really interesting. I never heard anybody actually lay out the difference between the two. Very helpful. And we're running low on time. So we need to kind of wrapping it up here. I'd like to ask you a question I ask all of our guests. If there were 2 or 3 things that you want service members to remember as they prepare for their own transition, what are they?
Yeah, I'm going to keep this brief because I know we're running out of time. One, I would just say, know what your hobbies are. And if you don't have hobbies, begin now. Do not wait until your transition to figure out what you enjoy doing. Again, younger generations are a little bit starting better at this than the older generations. So if you don't know how to ask the question, what you would do in your free time if you had it, then it's a good time now. So the second thing I'm going to say goes along with that is just, second thing is, have conversations with your family. Make this dinner conversations so that you're both making these decisions together. And maybe consider the first 6 months, maybe we don't do nothing. Like, a lot of people are just, I'm going to do nothing for 6 months, but grow a beard and sit in my chair and just exercise when I want to. Nothing wrong with that. However, a lot of marital issues start because of that. So what I'm going to suggest is maybe consider taking a class, a workshop, a course. Does not mean it has to be a life or career decision, but something you're interested in. Woodworking, pottery, painting, just something. Music. Some people are going back to music and playing an instrument, but something for the first 6 months where you are learning something that has nothing to do with the military and maybe is for no one but you. And just test the waters on some things that used to bring you joy, but maybe haven't gotten, any attention or haven't seen the light of day for a very long time.
All right. So making PowerPoints is not a hobby.
Not a
And
hobby.
I need to go get that trumpet that I promised my daughter I would pick up again.
Yes.
That's great. Corie, where can people find you, follow your content, or purchase your books?
Thank you so much. Easiest is my website is just my name, CorieWeathers.com. My social media is all the same handle. It's just Corie LPC. And I just also want to say, if you are maybe interested in trying to figure out what that next transition step for you is, my husband and I partnered with Second Service Foundation and created a whole on-demand course where we use the Strength Finder to help you figure out what your strengths are if you're thinking about starting a business, or maybe if you need to be talked out of starting a business. This course will help you make some of those decisions and know what your strengths are to help inform your transition a little bit better. That's why they call it's your second service. This is your first. Now that you're transitioning, what's the second thing that you want to get involved in? So just want to throw that resource out there as well.
Wow. Okay. We will have that in the episode notes along with your website. Corie, thank you so much. This was better. And I was anticipating this being great. It was even better than great. Thank you so much for coming on, sharing your knowledge and guidance for those of us that are preparing for our own transition.
Thank you so much for having me, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. We'll be in touch. And Corie has left the virtual studio, and Sis is trying to remember what her Myers-Briggs type is.
I found it. It's naturally the entertainer, ESFP-A.
I don't even know what that means. If it doesn't start with I don't know what it means.
I don't even know what I means. But I'm going to have to go back and look at it, or maybe because it was so long ago, maybe I've just grown since then. And I need to retake it. I don't know.
I think so. I noticed that I was an INTJ and now I'm an INFJ. And I think it's just because I'm a little bit older and understand and have kind of worked through feelings more and have matured. So I would be surprised if you didn't change a little bit. I think life does that to us, right?
Oh yeah.
Any reflections or thoughts on this conversation?
There were so many things to talk about. I think she's somebody that we probably could either have her on for another hour or invite her back. But it's just really lovely to see the work that she's been doing for the past 20 years, really servicing the people that are focusing on their transitions and how they can really dig deep on who they are as a person to make the transition just a little bit easier for them as an individual and within whatever relationships they have, if it's in a marriage or in a personal relationship or with family. And when she did say, have the conversations with your family, I think that's really important because so many people, maybe not just in the military, but I know as a person that's not in the military, we always have those issues of going to family and being able to talk to them about things because we feel like we need to do it on our own. And that's just not the case. And she's proving that having these conversations with someone who's licensed or with people that you trust around you is just very important.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a really great observation. I don't know. Normally I have some type of observation that stands out. I think I'm going to have to, when I do the post-production on this, something's going to come to me. But I did think about the title of what I'm going to title this episode. Obviously, if you've clicked on the link and you're listening to this, you already know what the title is, but I'm going to, that's
the future.
I know the future. So you know what? It's been a little bit of a longer recording. I'm just going to keep it at that. And if you're listening to me, jack my jaw, bob my gums, run my suck, continuing to talk right now, thank you very much for being a listener. I hope the information that you got something out of this episode. And do me a favor, do somebody else a favor. If you think this information is going to help somebody you're working with or somebody you know that's getting ready to transition or maybe just needs to hear about what it means to find closure, share the episode, subscribe to our content, give us a 5-star review. It helps us beat the data analytics when somebody goes into a search field looking for a podcast or looking for a video on YouTube. We are on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, other major podcast platforms, including YouTube, so you can subscribe to our content. If you want to give us some feedback, you can send us an email. We will get your email at newmissionct@gmail.com. That's New Mission Charlie Tango. We're also on Instagram, but you can hit us up. You can also hit us up on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear your feedback, and we're always looking for the next guest. If you are preparing for your own transition, know that I'm right there with you. So until next time, stay focused.